Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University. And welcome to our Folks Conversation series. Tonight, Nicole Gelinas and her latest book, Movement. It's got a great subtitle. You ready? New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car. If you are seeing right now that the QR code, take out your phone because this is a book worth having. There's also a 25% discount for folks, people. So we'll show you that screen again at the end, but if your phone is out. This book is enormously interesting. You don't have to be a New Yorker to love it, but it helps to be someone who really worries about how decisions get made for land use planning and how you literally play local politics. If you are someone who's aware, and our folks audience is aware of pretty much everything, of the classic Robert Caro biography of Robert Moses, who was called the master builder, responsible for building all the bridges and the tunnels and the parks and the beaches of New York City. That book was, it's a classic, but this book is like, I would say like the Power Broker Part 2. It's like a sequel. It picks up for where we are now, and it also deals with Robert Moses and some of the issues that he dealt with, and actually in many ways rehabilitates Robert Moses because he's gotten beaten up a lot recently. Our author, who I'm going to bring on in a second, Nicole Gelinas, Sean. Nicole is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which is the think tank here in New York City. She's also a contributing editor at the City Journal, and many people read her columns in the New York Post regularly. Nicole, welcome to Folks.
Good evening, Vane.
Before we start, there's some buttons here to press. There's always a donate button. We love that button. There's also a send the link to your buddy button. You can send a message and send a link to say, oh my God, Nicole Gelinas is on Folks tonight. Let me tell my friends. So that's how you use that. There's also the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll have some time maybe to take some questions at the very end. Nicole, enormously interesting book. Congratulations on it.
Thank you.
Let's start with the title itself, which I found very alluring. And Folks tends to be, our conversations philosophical. And I think, yes, movement means mass transit, and then people think it's the battle between mass transit and the car. But I think movement, in your case, deals with a number of things. For instance, the vitality of the city itself. We talk about New Yorkers always as on the go, a mile a minute. New York is synonymous with movement, not just cars and subways, but people who are always, moving in one direction, moving quickly and purposefully. Also, politically, movements. You describe often, the various different community activism that went into stopping certain land use projects and starting some of them. People who advocated for bike lanes, people who advocated for cityscapes and public plazas. So movement has a lot of connotations, I think, in your book. Let's start with this question. I read your book and said, God, I think Nicole is worried about New York. I think she's worried about the survival of New York, that in the post-pandemic era, that this city took some hits that we might not be able to recover from unless we recover in some ways, our love of our use of mass transit and our love of actually taking in the city by walking it and biking it.
Yes, so when I started this project, it was a valedictory in that it was 2019. I had about 1.5 chapters finished when the pandemic hit and the lockdown hit, and they said we all had to leave the library. So in the end of 2019, the first 2 months of 2020, the pitch was New York has a record population. It has a near record number of people on the subways. It has a near record traffic level. It has a record number of jobs. Everybody across income levels wants to be in New York because New York is where the opportunity is. Whether you are a high income earner, you have to be in New York if you want to excel in a few high paying professions, or you are just coming up in the world and you don't have great English skills, and this is a place where you can get a job in a restaurant or get a job in a hotel and provide for your family so that they can be the next rising generation. So it was very much, we have succeeded and this is how we succeeded. Everybody knows the story of how New York City cut crime starting in 1990 and the decline in crime and disorder, the rise in the perception and reality of public safety helped to rebuild the city's population, rebuild the tax base. But people don't think as much about the transportation system. When we began to allow the subways to fall apart and we let cars take over the public spaces of the streetscape, that made it very, very difficult for New York City to adapt starting in the second half of the 20th century when these things kind of became entrenched. It wasn't until over a very long, slow, painful set of movements, these are measured in decades, not years or months, that the city started to re-embrace the mass transit system, started to think about how it could think of the streets differently, that the streets are not just places to cram full with cars. It wasn't until we started thinking about that and having some modest successes that we were able to overcome the city's very real problems of the
Nicole,
1970s in particular.
sorry, but I think that just so the audience knows, when you're talking about the slow processing of it, it's really, after the recovery of 9/11, most of the reforms that took place in New York, really took place in the 21st century. So that it really is a recent phenomenon where crime rate was going down every single year. Mass transit had improved itself. There was no crime. And so people were drawn to the city. There were decades. I've had students always question this, of saying, are you kidding me? I'm saying, yeah, when I was a kid in New York City, no one wanted to live here in the 1960s. The city nearly went bankrupt in the early 1970s. There was an enormous amount of what was called middle-class white flight, and the tax base completely eroded. So you're right when you're saying that it took a while to get it to happen. But are you ultimately saying that when COVID happened, just about the time that you were riding high on working on this book, it collapsed in a way that made it, in your mind, similar to what we were starting to see in the 70s?
The way New York proved to be not very resilient during COVID was truly shocking, considering that we were very resilient after 9/11. I think a lot of people would have thought, if you have a huge challenge such as the pandemic, at least New York is in a good position to deal with that type of challenge. We are a wealthy city. We have enormous tax resources. We know how to deal with public safety. We know how to deal with public health. Instead, the city just kind of collapsed overnight. The spike in the city's crime, for example, the murder rate rising 52% over 2 years, biggest increase in homicide in such a short time frame ever, far outpaced the national increase in homicide. We are still far behind in our recovery. Our jobs base just collapsed. We're behind there in our recovery as well.
Did we lose
So in terms
population
of,
growth as well?
yeah, I mean, we lost, it's kind of startling that 500,000 people who lived here and presumably had ties to the city just up and left, overnight. I mean, if you were here during the months of the pandemic, as I was, I didn't leave Manhattan from January 2nd, 2020 until June 2022. Just people throwing all their stuff in the street and leaving. That was sort of the newcomers to the city that just very quickly abandoned it. But also people who had ties, people who had kids in school, just either moved to the suburbs, moved down to Florida, and that was sort of it. Now,
But
that
I'm
doesn't
sorry,
mean
Nicole, did we not recapture those numbers?
no, we have recaptured a different population mix, but we are still below our pre-pandemic population.
So you're saying
We
that
lost.
500,000 number still sounds right to you?
Oh
That
yeah,
we're
we have New York and San Francisco experienced the biggest population decline during the pandemic, and we haven't recovered. And these are primarily higher income earners who left. And you can see that in the rents, despite the hype. I mean, I'm in a market rate rental building in Manhattan. They did not raise the rent this year. There's no, the city is not a disaster. The city is not empty. But in terms of continuous population growth, we're always hitting records in population, always hitting records in jobs. Our problem is where do we fit all these people onto the transit system? That is not the problem right now. We have different problems than we did 5 years ago.
Well, one problem is a change in how people go to work. The pandemic introduced an idea for in elections where now we vote by mail, which we didn't do before the pandemic. And now we work at home, and we're told that we can actually be more productive. And I think what you point out in the book, it also tends to be high earners are the ones that are part of that tax base are the ones that are working from home. And it seems to me that given the fact that the book is designed to talk about as a remedy to sort of revitalize the city, this is a real problem when people are not actually hitting the streets and needing to go to work. And I'm wondering whether that is something that can change. I know there's some companies that are trying to go back to 5 days, some are 3 days, but it seems to me the concept of working from home is incompatible with the world of Brooklyn and Manhattan and the other boroughs.
Well, COVID was the biggest challenge to New York's business model since the 1960s, in that in the 1960s, we lost our factory jobs and we began to replace them with white-collar office jobs. That worked, but it took a very long time for it to work. And the good thing from the city's perspective about jobs in finance, law, advertising, fashion, you had to be here in Manhattan. You couldn't do these jobs from wherever you lived that was cheaper and more pleasant. If you want to make it big in these industries, you have to come to work 5 days a week. And you saw that in the 1966 transit strike. People moved heaven and earth to come to work every day, even though the mayor said they didn't have to, because they wanted to prove to themselves and their employer that they were essential workers, everyday essential workers. So it wasn't until 2020 that we kind of proved that we don't have to come to work every day to be essential white-collar workers. Now, it's very different than it was in 2020. People are not staying home. You can go out there, it's busy, you'll hear some honking, but people are also not going to work 5 days a week. They're tending to go in 3 days a week, 4 days a week. They'll go through stretches of 5 days and then go through stretches of 2 days. So that's an important change in that the white collar world has shown New York that for the first time ever, the power lies with the employers and the employees. It doesn't lie with the city. There is some pain point past which people will not stay in the city. They will leave the city. And we saw that happen quickly in 2020. We see it on a more marginal basis now, where if you don't want to deal with the quality of life and other issues in Midtown, you have a choice to come in that day. Maybe you make the choice not to come in. So that's why our subway ridership is still only 80% of pre-COVID normal, whereas other cities, London, Paris, Tokyo, have fully recovered.
But do we need to get back to 5 days a week in
No,
order?
we're
It
not
seems to me
going.
that there's two things that you're talking about. One thing is that the need to actually find a transit system to get us to work, but the other thing is to make the city attractive to be walking around, to just
Right.
being in the
So,
city, walking, biking around. Those are the
yes.
things that what you're fighting against now is, even though people are working at home, they still want to go, you still want them to go out. You don't
Oh,
want
yeah.
them to just watch Netflix. There has to be a way to make sure that what it was, for instance, the description that you gave about the 1960s, I was here, I'm of a certain age. So I know that what was interesting about the flight of middle-class flight is the city actually became very interesting in a different way. The rents were cheap, restaurants were cheap. The city was completely falling apart, but it was fun to be here if you were of a certain age, if you could live with the crime. It's hard to believe people didn't use the subways at night. They never went into Central Park at night. They didn't even go in at dusk. That all changed in the last 20 years. In the 1960s, throughout most of the 70s, there was a real sense of the menace of the city. which got corrected, as you're right, by the 1990s. But I think that we're talking about a number of different things, including the increase in crime both above and below ground, right? Because you point out in the book, the story, was it Michelle Go? Is that her name?
Yeah, so you're right. We're talking about two different things. If we were sitting here in the 1960s or the early 1970s and you said, do we need our factory jobs back? Well, yes, we would, but we didn't have a choice in the matter. They left no matter what New York was going to do. So do we need people to come back 5 days a week? Yes, but we don't really have a choice in the matter. People have proven they can work 3 to 5 days a week. Some industries 5, some 2, some people are working and they've just totally gotten rid of their office. So it's a mix, but we are not going back to the 5 day week, 9 to 5, I'm in there every day work week. It's just not happening.
But
So
that doesn't mean that the city can't regain its vitality and
exactly.
robustness, even if people are working at home.
Exactly. But there's two things there. Replace those transit trips with other types of transit trips, which means being different in how we think about leisure trips and reorganizing the transit system so that it's not just designed as it has been since the mid 1800s when it was horse-drawn omnibuses to bring people into core Manhattan in the morning and send them back to wherever they came from at night. So we need much better trips between one part of Brooklyn to another part of Brooklyn, from Queens to the Bronx. So it's not, when people are not doing that regular to Manhattan and home trip, they are doing other types of trips, and that's something that the city's transit system has to accommodate over time.
But some things don't are transit resistant, so to speak. What I'm thinking of is where I live. The Brooklyn waterfront has been completely opened. Where I live used to be just factories, very blue collar. Now it's a bunch of young people. I'm the oldest person in my neighborhood by far. And the whole waterfront is now open. So there's ways to walk around and enjoy the city. I mean, I think we've done, this is significantly different and improved from the 1970s, where everything was run down and old and broken, and just the city didn't work. They used to talk about the city didn't work. It just was broken. But now if you're walking around, you don't get that sense. You get a sense of maybe there's an increased crime, but the city in many ways is splendid, just walking around certain neighborhoods that didn't even exist in the 1970s, right? I
Oh
mean,
yes, and
Tribeca.
in
Yeah, go ahead.
neighborhoods that are outside the core of Manhattan right now are actually doing well, even better than they were before the pandemic. If you go
Yeah.
out to Park Slope, for example, people are eating more restaurant meals in their neighborhood because they're not going to Manhattan every single day. So that's good.
Well, that's
But
just an interesting thing. I'm sorry. That's an interesting thing, right? That the pandemic might have actually helped out the neighborhoods to make
yeah,
them more vital because people didn't feel like they needed to go into Manhattan.
yes, and even if you take a walk along Fordham Road in the Bronx, there's no retail vacancies. It's not like core Manhattan where we've got a 20% retail vacancy rate because we depend on tourists, business travelers, and commuters. And though they're not back in the same numbers. Whereas if you live along Fordham Road, you are doing more shopping in that neighborhood because you're not doing shopping incidentally on your way home from your job at a retail store in Manhattan, at a hotel in Manhattan. You're spending more of that money in the neighborhood.
And
So
and, and it doesn't keep you in town to see it Broadway either, right?
right,
I mean,
although people certainly want to come to Manhattan for leisure reasons. Leisure has been the first thing to recover. People want to be in hotels. People sat home for years. There's still revenge spending and people spending down the money they saved during the pandemic. So it's certainly nothing like a ghost town. There are people around, but there are real challenges in the inflection point of, do we build on 60 years of reinvigorating mass transit and reinvigorating the streetscape, or do we take the easy way out and say, more people want to be in their cars, they feel safer that way, we'll just let them turn to their cars? Because history shows New York does not do well when car growth is growing and risking becoming a dominant over mass transit.
We'll get to cars in a minute. Let me just go quickly ask you about crime. We did an event years ago on women in real estate. We had 3 women who were involved in big projects. And I remember one of the things that one of them said was, don't kid yourself. Without the significant decrease in crime, there would never have been Hudson Yards, the Times Square project, or Battery City. And you think about those 3 neighborhoods now that are so, what do you mean there wouldn't be the revival of Times Square? Wouldn't be Battery City. It really required. So your book talks about, it's a terrible tragedy or irony that right now Daniel Penny is facing a jury. I think that was the person who was arrested over the summer for putting a homeless person in a chokehold on a subway car who was threatening subway riders. And so now he's being prosecuted for, I think, manslaughter. And today was closing arguments in the case. And so this to me sounds like the Bernard Goetz case, which really that was the subway vigilante. It's starting to feel a little like, issues around crime are taking over in terms of people's perceptions, especially New Yorkers themselves, things they're willing to do that they weren't going to do before. And I'm wondering whether, that was a significant difference for 2 decades where people would ride the subways all night, wouldn't even think about it. And now I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah, so 1990, again, the peak year for New York City crime. And that year we had 26 homicides on the New York City subways, including Brian Watkins, a young tourist from Utah in town for the US Open.
Oh, right, with his mom, right?
Yes, with his family.
Yep.
That was a real turning point for the city, both for broad reasons and idiosyncratic reasons. I think the idiosyncratic reasons are just as important because we had just as high profile subway homicides and essentially nobody cared. And this was a turning point because David Dinkins was a new mayor. He loved tennis. He loved the US Open. He had encouraged people to take mass transit when they came to town for the US Open. So he felt this as a real personal affront. He had run on a law and order platform. He had run against Giuliani. He was almost just as law and order as Giuliani was. He was running on adding more police. So to have this murder at his, related to his favorite hobby, tennis, he just couldn't abide by it. And there was a lot of pressure on him to do even more than he was doing. So that's the year that the city and state government kind of combined forces to raise a tax, give that money toward adding more police into subway, give the police the 9mm Glock. So that wasn't so much so that it wasn't the Glock in itself, but it was the trust in the police that improved morale, that they were being trusted with this much more high-powered weapon. And Bill Bratton, put in place as the transit subway chief of police, sort of demonstrated if we go after the small crimes, the fare beating, the aggressive panhandling, you will prevent the larger crimes because
just to be clear, that's what was called the broken window strategy.
Yes, and not everybody who evades the fare will commit a larger crime in the subway system, but a significant percentage of them will. So if you stop them evading the fare, they will not then assault a person, or they will not menace and rob a person, and you prevent these crimes from escalating. And that worked almost overnight. The crime in the subway fell by double-digit percentages. Nothing else in the city changed. The city was in recession. We weren't suddenly gaining massive population. We didn't fix all the root causes of education and mental health. It was this one change that had an immediate effect. I'm not saying it's a solution to all the problems in the world, but it was a solution to this problem.
But Nicole, we are now, I see it all the time in my neighborhood. We are seeing fare evaders. I see people jumping over the turnstiles.
Well,
so the number has increased, right?
Yes, so from the homicides in 1990, 26 homicides that year, by 1997, we got it down. So we had 1 or 2 homicides a year, every year, consistently until 2019. 2020, we had 7 homicides. And keep in mind, this was with a fraction of the people onto subways. 2021, we had 7 homicides. 2022, we had 11 homicides. Last year, we had 6, and now we've got 10. So an enormous change in the public safety environment on the subway system, basically increasing the average annual homicide number by 5-fold relative to the pre-COVID normal. This has a huge effect on people's psychology. You know, I have people say all the time, oh, you know, 11 homicides is not a lot of people. There's a lot of ways you could die. You probably won't die on the subway. Of course, it is a small number, but relative to what it was before and
Right.
relative to what we can do, if you are going to go out there and say these people are expendable, then why should anyone care about your quality of life issue, whether it's reducing traffic deaths, reducing cyclist deaths, and improving infant mortality rates, all of these things. If you can't do what you already proved that you can do in keeping subway homicide near negligible, how are you going to convince anyone to do things that we haven't done before?
Let's talk a little about Robert Moses, and then we're going to get to cars. In many ways, this book has a revisionist take on Moses, and it's interesting. For people who knew who he was, he for decades, you know, was the chairman of what was called, I think, the Tri-Borough Bridge Authority, and he had enormous control on urban planning and was responsible for pretty much building everything from tunnels to bridges. And he was iconic. He worked through different mayors and different governors. And so everyone sort of credits him, among other things, of like being slavishly rewarding of the car, in love with the car, that everything was around building a ring around the city so that people can drive around, developing new bridges and tunnels. Then there was sort of, I think became a theory that every time you built another bridge on the thinking that it would reduce congestion, it actually brought more congestion. So it only meant a self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh yes, we need another bridge in order to connect the boroughs. But one of the things that you're saying about him is that the concept of the car and buses was not his invention. That the ideas for the bridges and for the favoritism for cars and buses over subways and trolleys started before him. And that what he really did was sort of respond to what was already there. And he really knew how to work the system so extremely well. I think you used the word a supplicant, not so much a power broker, but actually a supplicant, which is a very interesting take. And to say that he, you know, he was just responding to a number of entities like business leaders, civic leaders, the press, the people themselves that, you know, love the idea of the open road of Route 66. Even New Yorkers love the car. There was a time, it still is a time, most commercials are about cars. New York is always fighting against the culture of America that wants to be in a car on the open road.
Yes, so in the 19 teens and the 1920s, this was when New York began to embrace the car. And if you were to put yourselves in the minds of the people who did that, they thought the car is the next big thing. People want to be in cars. This is a terrific invention. We better start redesigning city around the car or we're going to be left out. So throughout the 1920s, there was a group of prominent private citizens called the Regional Plan. And they talked to all sorts of experts and consultants and sort of, you know, the McKinsey of its day, and came up with the blueprint that would eventually become all of the highways, expressways, parkways that we built. This was the graphic regional plan came out in the late 1920s. During the time that these prominent citizens were putting together this plan, Moses was gaining his public reputation because he was doing his first Long Island projects, the Southern State Parkway and Jones Beach, but he wasn't an eminence grise where you would go to him and say, oh, let's ask what Moses thinks we should do and we will do that. He was just a young man making his reputation. He was not the person whom the experts depended on to come up with this. They came up with this independently, and starting in the 1930s, Moses was the person that they tapped to implement this because he proved very good at navigating a bureaucracy. He was a good, handy face for politicians to hide behind when residents of an area were upset about a project that was going to affect them. If you were the mayor or you were the city council person, or that was later, or if you were board of an alderman, you could say, don't blame me, this is Moses. When in fact, every single project that Moses built was fully approved and funded by elected officials, state, local, and micro-local level. It is absurd to say that for 4 decades, one mean, clever, villainous man tricked all the governors, tricked all the mayors, tricked all the city council people into building things they did not want to build. Every single project that he built, there was political consensus that it was a good idea to build it, including the Cross Bronx Expressway. Moses became a villainous figure rather than a heroic figure when the city changed its mind and decided it did not want to continue to build what it said it wanted to build. So starting in the 1960s, people started to blame him rather than blame themselves.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's more to it than that, but all he did in terms of roads, we're not talking about parks, we're not talking about housing, we're not talking about the beach. With the road projects, he executed exactly what other people who had more power than he did wanted him to execute.
But people who blame him, here's something that I'd love to talk about. People who, people forget that the Broadway musical West Side Story is essentially now where Lincoln Center is. And people always blamed him for that. They said, you didn't just move people to build bridges and connecting tissue for bridges, highways, but you also did things like Lincoln Center that, completely changed the composition of people in Hell's Kitchen. And we know that, he wanted to build, and other, the housing projects, right, were something that was his domain. And some people were saying, well, that ultimately, created an enormous amount of dislocation. So there were some areas. I love what you're saying about how, when it came to the car, he didn't stand in anyone's way. He was just a good technocrat and he knew how to get things done. But there were other areas that he was more of a visionary in terms of it was his idea. Or are you saying even those things were not his ideas?
No, certainly Jones Beach, he deserves all the credit he gets in the sort of good Robert Moses casting. That was his thing. He did it. The parks, both within and without New York City, that was his vision. But with the road projects, it was almost like he did that so he could do the things that he wanted to do. Now, with housing, that's a whole other discussion, but I will just point out there is nothing stopping us from bulldozing Lincoln Center and the Fordham campus there and the Opera House and Juilliard and turning that back into tenements. There is nothing in the world that says, oh, we made this mistake, let's undo the mistake. We don't do that because we prefer what we have there. Every day that it stays there, this is revealed preference. The city as a whole prefers that it be the way that it is and not the way that it was. Same thing with the Cross Bronx Expressway. You want to get rid of it, you can get rid of it, but we don't because we need it. You need a road connection between New Jersey and the northeastern United States, and that is the connection.
Great answer. Great anecdote in the book that people forget. People say, it's not true so much anymore because I live in Brooklyn, but people would say Brooklyn, when the Dodgers left Brooklyn, it was never the same. And, the Dodgers ended up in Los Angeles. I don't know. Did they win the World Series this year? I think they won the World Series this year. That World Series could have been a Brooklyn World Series. Can't remember who won this year. But when the people used to say for decades, when we lost, and then of course, Robert Moses ended up, demolishing Ebbets Field, which was where they played, and building whatever he was building. I think he built the housing projects there. But people forget where the name Dodgers comes from.
Mhm.
It comes from the trolleys because apparently these electrical motorized trains, which was the dominant way of getting around before the car replaced it, was dangerous. People were constantly dodging the trolley cars. And that's where I think people go, where did they get the name the Dodgers? It was because of this electrical train. But what you point out in the book is interesting is that that was a perfectly great way of getting around the city, right? It was a great way. And what ultimately happened, I think you pointed out, I forgot the name of the mayor, who had a problem with the transit system and subways and cars, and he wanted to prefer buses. And that was the beginning of thinking about cars being a way to get yourself around New York. Is that right?
Yeah, so there were three mayors starting right after the turn of the 20th century and going well into the 1930s who wanted to get rid of the trolleys. Mayor Hyland, he hated the private sector transit companies. It's kind of like how people hate the fossil fuel companies. He just hated these private companies that ran the trolleys. He saw them as exploitative monopolies, which they kind of were. So his answer to that is not, we'll have a different management structure. It was just, we'll get rid of the trolleys. Then you had Walker, whose motive was corruption. Maybe some people may see parallels to today's mayor. He saw a lot of opportunity for himself in getting rid of the trolley contracts and awarding new bus contracts because there was kickbacks in the bus contracts. May seem like an absurd reason to rip up a priceless piece of transportation infrastructure, but when you look at how New York government operates today, we do absurd things. And then LaGuardia, he didn't like trolleys. He was a futurist. He saw buses as the wave of the future, supported by the business community. Get rid of the trolleys, they are in the past, make way for the buses, which are the future. And by the way, Moses had nothing to do with any of this. Much of this was before his time. The part during LaGuardia, Moses was not focused on the New York City streets. He was focused on much larger New York City divided highway,
Public
limited
works.
access highway projects. He was not
Yeah.
sort of whispering in the mayor's ear, get rid of the streetcars. That was the business community, civic groups, neighborhood groups. Everyone just sort of forsook the trolley for the diesel bus.
But
And
but
so we got rid of the base of our mass transit system without any input really from Robert Moses.
so the concept of disposing of the trolley system, given the fact that we know that the Brooklyn Dodgers were there because it was almost like a public safety issue. In your book, you point out something very interesting about how, before the use of the car in the city, there were no stoplights, right? And so people sort of had more access. Nobody was controlling their ability. That's why people got hit by the trolleys, because you just had to figure out a way to be careful and crossing the street. You point out something in the book when mothers used to send their kids to go run an errand or bring lunch to the father, they were worried because there was people zigzagging in and out, and it was probably incredibly dangerous in a way. But eventually what we did is we had two things different. We ended up putting in lights for the cars, and then we also exposed ourselves to distracted drivers because they too cause accidents, in fact, probably more so than the trolleys.
Right. So there's no question that the car and the truck became far more dangerous to pedestrians and to other car drivers than the trolley and the trains had ever been. I mean, when we had more than 1,000 traffic deaths a year, starting in the 1920s and going through for decades, the motor vehicle, very dangerous, still is very dangerous. But people didn't know that when they were getting rid of the trolleys. To the people in the trolley era and the train track era, hundreds of deaths a year people being hit by a train, people being hit by a trolley, even some people getting hit by a horse cart. They
Right.
resented this. People, it wasn't just Mayor Hyland that resented the train companies. You remember the Grand Central, well, you don't remember, but I'm sure you read about it, the Grand Central train crash,
Yeah.
and that was what first forced the city and state government to force the electrification of the trains coming into Manhattan in the first decade of the 20th century. So the trains were perceived as unsafe, uncaring about the public, didn't care about their workers, didn't care about customers when it came to safety, which was not incorrect. If you were a mother in the 1920s, you are more worried about your kid being hit by a train. You have no yard for the kids to play in. There's no one governing this. These are just uncaring companies. So people did not know that the car was going to become and was becoming much more dangerous. You live in the era that you live in.
So let's just briefly talk about two people that I think are interesting that people didn't know. Shirley Hayes and the Washington Square Park movement, and Jane Jacobs and her efforts to stop Moses from essentially putting a highway through the middle of the city that would have knocked out Little Italy, I think, and Soho and parts of the village. It would have been like Chicago, the way there's a highway that runs straight through the middle. Moses thought that was a really cool idea. So there were these two women that put a stop to that. I love the fact that they're women in an era in which you wouldn't think of them. I know that when I was in graduate school reading Jane Jacobs, one of the things that was interesting about her that I know was consistent with your book is that she just believed, because I think she lived on Hudson Street in the West Village. And so she believed that what made New York interesting and essential was the stoop. People sitting on the stoop, people looking out their windows. It even prevented crime, right? You didn't want people in cars. You wanted people walking around. You wanted people talking and observing. That was a very New Yorker kind of thing. You're observing, you're checking things out, you're seeing things. And putting people in cars isolated them and made them more menacing in a way. And so it is interesting to think about the Washington Square Park would have had a road right through it, right? That would have been for cars and buses. And Shirley Hayes put an end to that. These are sort of heroic figures in urban planning, right?
Yes, and there were two road projects. So there was a project to make the existing road through Washington Square Park wider. So if people are familiar with Central Park, there are the carriage drives, and they were built for horse carriages until a few years ago, cars went through them. And it was the same thing in Washington Square Park. There was a modest road that went through the park, and buses actually went through the
I'm
park.
sorry, how did that affect the fountain?
Well, the fountain was disused. I mean, it was there, but it was kind of
But
infrastructure.
was it next to the road next to the fountain?
Yes, it
Okay.
was. So people bringing their kids to the playground, they had to contend with the buses going through the park. But people just kind of put up with this. You know, there were always buses there. There would always be buses there. Then the city came along in the early 1950s under Mayor Wagner and Moses and said it wanted to widen that road through Washington Square Park. It was effectively going to build a limited access road through the park where you would have to climb upstairs with your baby carriage and walk across an overpass just to go from one half of the park to the other. Shirley Hayes, young mother at the time, she had no urban planning background. Unlike Jane Jacobs, she was not an intellectual. And she said, this is not a good idea. We don't want a wider road through the park. And maybe we shouldn't even have the road that's already in the park. So it took 13 years for her to successfully marshal her neighbors and beat this road and actually get rid of the existing road through Washington Square Park. And she figured out the trick that Jane Jacobs would need, which was you don't fight Robert Moses, you fight the elected officials. So she went after Mayor Wagner. She went after Carmine DeSapio, who was the Greenwich Village district leader. He needed to keep his elected seat in that district because it was his base of power. So he needed to keep people like her happy. I mean, when she gathered 30,000 signatures, this was a third of the village population. You cannot ignore these people and expect to keep your seat in office. So putting the pressure on the elected officials, and then they stop Moses from building the project, that worked. And Jane Jacobs would do the same thing a decade later with the Lower Manhattan Expressway, the much bigger road project or highway project that would have gone, as you said, across Little Italy, across Soho
So,
in Lower
yeah.
Manhattan.
It,
But even that fight, you know, when people say she beat Moses, she did not beat Moses. The people of New York City beat John Lindsay, and that in 1969, he was in his own tough re-election fight. He had run 4 years earlier on canceling the expressway. He had just stalled and stalled and stalled and tried to buy time. And then when he needed these anti-highway people to vote for him again, he abruptly just canceled the highway. So it was pressure on the elected officials that worked and that still works.
but I think the legend about it, I don't know whether this is true or not, that while what you're saying is right, Moses bristled at the idea that he
I
could
mean,
be
he can
stopped, right?
bristle.
That
Yeah,
he
he
was
can
pissed
bristle all he
off, right?
wants, but yeah,
Right? Who is this lady Jane Jacobs who lives that,
right.
that she could stop me, the master builder? I'm Moses.
Right. I mean, she made his life more difficult, but he
Right,
was not the final
right. She
decider.
didn't fight him, right?
Yes.
Now,
And even this idea that he had built this empire out of nickels, it was not a secret that Triborough, once it was finished with its final project, the Verrazano, it would start to build up a surplus because it had nothing else to build. People had written academic papers about this in the 1950s. You know, what should we do with that money? There were proposals to use that money to subsidize other roads in New York State. It wasn't like this man was
right,
secretly building up this empire. People knew
right.
this.
People knew that money was there.
Yes.
So is Michael Bloomberg an aberration then? Because everything that you're describing didn't originate with the elected officials. People in your book, who were interested in mass transit, were interested in public space places, interested in various different other, bike sharing, ride sharing, city bike. Bloomberg seems to have been an elected official who had a vision that made him different, right? Like, for instance, Times Square, he shut down those streets and the traffic and turned it into a plaza. People thought, you can't do that. It's Times Square. And he did that. And he's created a lot of other things, things that are interesting, what you describe as cityscape or streetscape things. It makes him different. And the reason I want to ask you this, because the Manhattan Institute, I think, is considered a conservative think tank. And I always think when people talk about Republicans, they say, oh, they're all for big business. But Teddy Roosevelt, who's from New York City, and was a conservative Republican, he's the godfather of all of our national parks. As a conservative, he believes in conservation. So it seems to me he's not a good example of big business. He was a trust buster, but more importantly, he was the guy that built all these national parks. And I think what you're, in a way, saying, that conserving the urban life is another way, that this is not that mass transit is not a progressive's agenda, that this actually could theoretically be a conservative's agenda, and Michael Bloomberg might be an example of that.
Yes, and you have to see things in their context. So, should we go down to Houston and tell them they need to get rid of their single family houses and build a subway system and get rid of their cars? It's not going to work. It's probably not a good idea. Let them do what they want to do, and we will do what we want to do. I mean, that is the essence of federalism, which is, and it was an important conservative principle. And I do think Bloomberg was unique in that he was impervious to the public shaming that came from doing things like pedestrianizing Times Square, doing the city bike program, building the bike lanes. A lot of mayors, whether it was Koch, who actually backed down from his bike lanes, other Giuliani focused on public safety and not on other long-term streetscape issues, although actually he did some pretty good things for the streets too. Bloomberg inherited falling crime from two administrations. He had some breathing room to think not about what we don't want, but what about what we actually want in the city, and gave his transportation commissioner, Jeanette Sadekhan, the breathing room in turn to execute these plans. He wasn't going to her and saying, we got these terrible headlines, we got to just abandon these bike lanes because people are making fun of me. He let them play out for the long term,
But
and a
didn't
lot
he?
of mayors would not have done that. You see that with Adams. I mean, he backs down from controversial road projects when they annoy a certain constituency.
But it goes beyond cityscape for Bloomberg. You just reminded me as you were just talking. I thought, wasn't he the one that banned the 32-ounce cup for movies,
Yeah,
that
I mean,
for
he
soda, and people were
tried.
really mad. You can't take away my cup. And he said, you don't need a sugary drink of 32 ounces to sit in a movie theater and rot your teeth. And we're not going to do that. Similarly, didn't he also eliminate smoking in restaurants? There used to be smoking sections, and I think Bloomberg, figured he would take a hit, but he didn't seem to care. He just
Yes,
thought,
and
yeah, go ahead.
interestingly, you bring those things up. The smoking thing was one of the first things he did in office. He really didn't get to transportation until a few years later. So he was very focused on public health, not only continuing to cut crime, which is one of the most important public health considerations, but obesity, exercise, and so forth. And he sort of came around to transportation partly because he saw that that was part of the public health case. You can't get exercise if it's not safe to walk around your neighborhood, meaning that you might get hit by a car because some of these areas are just so dangerous, compared to other parts of New York City. So that was also part of an inequality issue that he or his commissioner addressed, and addressed successfully. I mean, they reduced the traffic fatality rate by double-digit percentages.
And among a way of doing that is just blocking the car's access and creating more public spaces where people could
Yes.
sit. Right, go ahead.
Exactly. So, people might see the 8th Avenue and wonder, why did you build these giant raised curbs in 8th
Yeah.
Avenue? They're just in the way, they're annoying. But you do that because you are narrowing the roadway. The car drivers on a narrow roadway will automatically go more slowly, and you don't have to cross a 6-lane expanse. It's down to 3 or 4 lanes, which is much more safely crossable.
You don't think, I'm going to throw out a few things and maybe you can answer it together. You don't think congestion pricing by itself, ride sharing, autonomous vehicles, the electric car itself, to you, that's not really the answer. Those could make some improvements, but you still think mass transit, if you want to challenge the car, the electric car, Uber, these are not the ways to get past that, right?
Right. So you can't do any of those things unless you have a successful mass transit system. If 75% of your people are not riding on the mass transit system instead of in cars, they are all going to be cluttering up the surface of the street. Unless you have most people underground, you have very little room to make changes above ground. So congestion pricing, a perfectly fine idea, but it's not dispositive. I mean, London does congestion pricing, fine. Paris doesn't, Copenhagen doesn't, Amsterdam doesn't, Stockholm doesn't, or Stockholm does. But you have cities with congestion pricing with well-managed streets, and you have cities without congestion pricing with well-managed streets. So that is not by itself a guarantor of well-managed streets.
Um, I'm going to take a question from the audience soon. So, so is there anyone in our elected world, whether New York State or city government, city council people, perhaps, is there anyone that has this right? Is there anyone that, you just said a moment ago, Adams would back down? You've described in the book what I would call a crisis of confidence. There are fewer people that live in New York. There's a increasing crime rate. There's job losses. We're not heading in the right direction. Is there someone who's writing about stuff other than you? And you're doing a wonderful job at it, by the way.
Thank
But
you.
are there other elected officials that have the right remedy for what's to, because I don't know whether you feel sanguine about the possibilities for relief here. For instance, I think that people in the 70s gave up on New York. If anybody watches Woody Allen's Annie Hall, that's like a running joke, right? New York is a dying city, Max, right? I mean, when you watch that movie in 2007 or 10, it wouldn't even make sense. Why would he say it's a dying city? But people believe that. First of all, do you think we are a dying city now? Are we in the same spot now that we were in 1973, 74, 75? Are we in that kind of a crisis? And do you see, because given what you said about working at home, do you see ways out of this? Because you're saying some of these things are not, ride sharing is not going to do it by itself. You have to do other things that are of a much bigger, ambitious scale.
Right. So no, we're not a dying city, but we are right now a stalled, confused city. And if we don't get out of that sort of being dazed and confused, we risk becoming a less successful city. For example, okay, we had between 2019 and 2021, the felony level in New York City rose by a third. And as I said before, the murder rate over 2 years rose, or the murder level rose by more than 50%. So the murder rate has fallen a little bit over the past 2 years, but it is nowhere back to where it was in 2019. And the felony rate, we've lost 20 years worth of progress on robberies, assaults, burglaries, car theft. So that people are not more concerned about that is somewhat concerning in itself, that you still have people that say, well, crime is not up, that's some kind of like conspiracy. Well, you can go look on the police website, it is significantly up. I mean, every piece of data, every piece of personal experience, and every anecdote from your family and friends shows that something has changed, and unless we can figure out how to change it back, that creates a real problem over time.
All right, we'll take one question from the audience here. We only have time for one. Then we'll have some closing comments and we'll say goodnight to Nicole. This was wonderful, Nicole. You're awesome. The book is awesome.
Likewise,
I
Dean.
really encourage you all to buy this book and to read it. It's a really great read and enormously interesting if you're interested in politics and urban planning, how things get done. It's got a great history lessons on New York. There's a lot of cool things you could hear from Nicole telling you. And what I was telling you, there was just a lot of cool things that you just didn't know about New York, and this book will tell you about it. This audience says, Nicole, how do you see the future of this war? This person puts it in quotes. So here, this person is referring to New York's long war to take back its streets from the car. She's referring, or he's referring to your word war playing out in New York City. How will technology help or hinder what's to come? You and I briefly mentioned that a second ago. But what I thought when I read that question, I thought it meant, well, how is it actually manifested? Do we see it as a war? Or do we need Nicole Gelinas to tell us we're at war, right? Or do people actually have a feeling that we are at war with the car and that the subway system is failing us and buses are failing us? You talk a lot in the book about, how we have to create access for people with disabilities to make it to make all of these subway stations accessible. Is there a discernible war that people can actually feel out there that is separate from the crime rate?
I think it feels like a political war in that people are very attached to their own way of life. And there's nothing wrong with that. So there's nothing wrong with pushing for marginal changes to have marginal improvements in, for example, if you are a person of a class of people with a lot of power, and this transcends income and race. So you've either got a rent regulated apartment or you bought an apartment a long time ago, and you also bought a house in the Hudson Valley a long time ago. And so these are the people who don't think of themselves as rich because they may not make a lot of money each year, but they are rich in assets. And these are the people who park a car on the street and they only use their car on the weekend. Ironically, they're using their car the way Moses envisioned. They live their life on transit during the week, and they use their car to go out to the country on the weekend. And
Or
that's why
Jones
Moses
Beach,
built
right?
the parkways. So these are the people, and it's a broad brush. I'm not saying they're bad people. They have their reasons that say, if you want to take away my free residential parking, that's bad, and I don't want you to do that. So this becomes a big political issue, which means it's very difficult to try something like Donald Shoup, the parking professor, would suggest, like, just charge people a $50 annual fee on this block to park their car, and let's just see how many of them say, you know what, I only use my car 3 times a year. I think I'll sell the car. Just marginal changes can make a big
Wow,
difference. And so
interesting.
no one is saying we're going to get rid of all cars. I mean, clearly there are still cars, but you don't want car traffic to be growing, and you want it every year to shrink, as it actually did from just before the year 2000 up until the eve of the pandemic. New York was depending less and less on the car and more on mass transit, on bicycles, on walking. That was actually working well. The risk is now that we've stalled and we'll start to go backwards, and we'll go backwards that it's such that you don't really notice it until it's too late.
I think before we say goodnight, that was a great insight too. Another anecdote about how you're right about people who had rent stabilized apartments or rent controlled apartments or bought their apartments decades ago and don't necessarily make much money, but they really don't suffer the experience of trying to figure out a way to live in New York. So for them, of course, they keep a car around. It's not that expensive. The carrying charges of living in New York for them are considerably less. When I was telling you about the 70s, was more my generation. People who were working as teachers or writers, right? They ended up buying houses in the Hamptons.
Yeah,
Now,
which is
today,
fine.
it's unimaginable to think that
Right.
on a school
Yeah.
teacher salary in 1975, you could go to Amagansett, buy a place, you had a rent stabilized apartment on West End Avenue, and you had a beach house. Now, that today is unimaginable. Both ends, the West End Avenue apartment is unimaginable. But what I'm saying is it's interesting how those times actually also created opportunities and created two sets of New Yorkers, right? One are totally disconnected from a certain reality because they're really not paying high market rents. All right, before we say goodnight to Nicole, we've had a few closing remarks, and including, let's see, what do we got, Zach? We've got, yes, the first thing to do is Giving Tuesday. That's tomorrow. Take out your phones. This is a wonderful way for you to contribute to folks. As you know, we believe in the expansion of the life of the mind. We think we're part of also another grand New York tradition of ideas put on stage and done in an entertaining way. So hopefully you'll support us. Also, stay in touch with us. There's a QR code if you want to stay on our mailing list. We've got tens and thousands of you. I think we're near like 200,000 now. So please sign up so we can know where you are and we can reach you. And then, of course, before we say goodnight, this book, Movement, New York's Long War to Take Back the Streets from the Car. You've been hearing Nicole Gelinas tonight, who's wonderful and lovely. The code is how you can buy the book. There's also a 25% discount for folks' audiences. So I hope you've all taken out your camera and took a picture of that. Nicole, you are a wonderful guest. We will continue to read you in the City Journal and primarily in your column with the New York Post. And we hope you'll be working on another book soon because you're really great at this and you've got a wonderful presence. And even though I'm not sure you're from New York, you are a New Yorker. You've proven yourself. You are a New Yorker all the way.
25 years. And I want to thank you, Thane, as well as Olivia and folks.
That's very sweet of you. Thanks so much, Nicole. I'm Thane Rosenbaum for folks. Until next time, good night.